Yes, thank you very much for this invitation. I took this opportunity to rethink what I've been working on, and that is the relationship between democracy and AI. There is not much yet published about this question. Particularly my own discipline, political science, hasn't done much in this field. There are few publications, but not many. So I thought I begin to tackle this question. I should perhaps do a bit of expectation management here. I do understand if you find it confusing. I'm not 100% sure yet about what I'm doing here myself. The title, as you can see, entails a sort of proposition, and that proposition could perhaps be spelled out like this. AI in the public discourse, but also in political science, is very often perceived as a threat to democracy. Many people are afraid that AI might take over and democracy might die. I think that is not a very helpful perception. It doesn't help us to understand the relationship between AI and democracy. So, in contrast to the public discourse, my proposal is to consider AI as an imaginary, because I think that imaginaries is one form in which technology spreads and a form in which society adopts and adapts technology to its own desires, perceptions of problems and needs. So what I think is that AI as an imaginary offers us new ways at looking at democracies, its structures, norms, and challenges. So much to my proposition. Now, shortly to the structure of my talk, I will start with a recap of the debate on AI and democracy. Then I will use a historic analogy to sort of spell out my own approach. And then I will look at traces of the cybernetic worldview in our practices, experiments with democracy, but also the way we talk about democracy today. And then I sum up. So let's start with the public view on AI and democracy. AI, as I already said, is today mainly regarded as a threat. And I think nobody formulates this idea better than Yuval Harari. Let me quote him. As he puts it, once we begin to count on AI to decide what to study, where to work, and whom to date or even marry, human life will cease to be a drama of decision-making. And our conception of life will need to change. Democratic elections and free markets might cease to make sense. That sort of summarizes what many people expect AI might do to us as society or democracy. Understood as a knowledge-generating technology, AI might produce better results than democratic discourse, since democratic discourse cannot even agree on what a problem is, and certainly less than what a solution might look like. If democracy rests on the idea of uncertain and contested knowledge, this is why we have ideas like deliberative democracy to discuss what we know and what we don't know. AI, on the contrary, promises correct answers to problems formulated by us. And this is why democratic theory at the moment is afraid that AI might become dominant because it looks superior to the way democracies discuss and produce knowledge. So I think this is not a good idea of looking at AI and democracy. It's a mistake to compare two ways of producing knowledge. The weakness of this approach already is to assume that AI might replicate the knowledge that we as humans and collectively in democratic settings produce. As many people say right now, the intelligence in artificial intelligence might be taken too literally. So here is an understanding of AI that we should have contest ourselves. But if this is not the right approach to look at democracy and AI as a relationship, how else could we approach the link between the two, and how should we think about it? It's really not easy to come up with a good way of approaching this question. This is why I resort these days to a historic analogy, and that is the idea or the imaginary of state as a clockwork. So this idea of the state as a clockwork entails a mechanical theory of government. Oh, I'm one too early here. The history of thinking about the state as a clockwork is fascinating on its own terms and has been told by historians of technology many times. The clock was invented around 1300, and roughly 400 years after its invention, the clock transformed into a powerful imaginary, particularly but not only in France and Germany. Foreshadowing the Industrial Revolution, political thinkers began to visualize the state and the government primarily in terms of clockworks. There is a book written by Otto Meyer. He was one of the founding directors of the Technical Museum in Munich. He wrote a whole book about this story. The state became to be seen as a machine that should run as smoothly as the clockwork. As Meyer writes, gradually people learned how to account for unfamiliar phenomena, not by resorting to the supernatural, but by identifying concrete, observable causes. They learned how to connect causes and effects into extensive linear cause and effect chains. Clocks, in short, helped to teach Europeans how to think mechanically. Mechanic theories of government implied an authoritarian understanding of order controlled from the top, with the governed as passive gears or wheels. The clockwork also represented a specific form of governing that is mechanical rather than moral and personal. The clock as such anticipates also the bureaucratic state that Max Weber described as businesslike, precise, soulless, like any machine. So the clock as an imaginary of the state was a powerful image that reformulated society's views of the state, how it should work, who it should work for, how it should function. There are 3 lessons that I think we can sort of gain from this historical analysis. The first one concerns the power of imaginaries. While the clock can be seen as an independent object of technology following core rules of operation, it unfolds its impact on state and society as an embodiment of zeitgeist and social imaginary. Jasanow defines socio-technical imaginaries as, quote, collectively held, institutionally stabilized, and publicly performed visions of desirable futures animated by shared understandings of forms of social life and social order attainable through and supportive of advances in science and technology. In other words, imaginaries absorb a lot in their images. It's not just about a technical artifact. It sort of captures what people think, how they perceive the world, and how they imagine and desire their future. This means that the ability to measure time as such does not explain the power of the clock. The function was around several hundred years earlier, but with regard to the state, the clock becomes influential as a representation of hegemonic debates, challenges, ideas and ideals of time. My second lesson concerns the conditions of imaginaries. As I said earlier, the clock became an imaginary of the state in a few states, but not in others. For example, Great Britain detested the clock as an imaginary for many reasons. It had other imaginaries envisioning the state of the future. Also, there were, of course, other imaginaries. There was the scale, there was the steam engine, the state was imagined as a ship or as a building. So there is no strict or causal connection between imaginaries and the state. So this means that imaginaries do not come out of the blue. They are firmly anchored in the world that makes use of them. In the case of the clock, one may say that the absolutistic state formed a conceptual space for anticipating rule of law, industrialization, and the constitutional state, able to describe all its functions in clear rules like a machine. As the political scientist Yaron Ezrahi argued, the clock symbolizes and thus intervenes in the emerging competition between moral and mechanical discipline, between a moral, personalized understanding of state functions and mechanical, rule-based self-regulatory systems which produce rational and predictable outcomes. In other words, imaginaries are always contested, and of course they compete against other imaginaries. And they may function in certain times as a weapon against a technology or against a competing imaginary. Third and last lesson, and one particularly important to me, technology as a medium. Technologies such as the timepiece are not only means for a certain purpose like measuring the time, they are also a form of medium. The emphasis of the medium quality of the clock reminds us of the distinction between form and medium as discussed but not invented by Niklas Luhmann. But particularly philosophy of technology in the recent years has put more emphasis on the medium quality of technology than Luhmann did. I would like to quote Gerhard Gamm in this context, who wrote that essentially technology is a medium for developing the self and the world, or as we say in German, Selbst- und Welterschließung. It doesn't translate well into English. Welterschließung is a mixture of sort of developing and sort of perceiving, recognizing, and discovering it. So now, that seems very important, that the clock allows us to look at the world in different ways, and that once we have done that, meaning using the clock to rediscovering the state, rediscovering ourselves in this world, there is never a way back. We will never be able to go back to our old worldviews before we started using the clock as an imaginary for our self-understanding. So now that we have looked extensively at the clock as an imaginary, we are ready to tackle the question anew about AI as a potential imaginary for democracy. If the clock was the paradigmatic example of the trivial machine, as the cybernetic people would do it, AI is an example of the non-trivial machine. And the question is now what kind of images the non-trivial machine might have for us to reformulate our understanding of democracy. Perhaps we should briefly describe what cybernetic thinking is about. Some people might be very familiar with this, others are not. Of course, I cannot do justice to this body of work in the framework of this presentation, but I want to highlight a few features that seem important in the context of thinking about AI and democracy. Cybernetic thinking, just as mechanical thinking, has developed into a worldview. The cybernetic theory implies a radical critique of the mechanical worldview. That seems really important in this context. If a mechanical theory emphasizes strict causal links between actions and effects, cybernetic theory criticizes this idea as simplistic and under-complex. If the mechanical worldview believes in the idea of universal rationality and centralized governance or steering, cybernetic thinking replaces causal models with the idea of permanent circular self-regulation. The focus on ontological beings shifts with cybernetic thinking to doing and behavior, and the distinction between human and non-human agency loses its importance. Linear models of evolution are replaced by interconnected systems that change through feedback loops. Such feedback loops now play a central role in the current systems of machine learning. Backpropagation is the term used today. Traces of cybernetic thinking can be found everywhere today, not least in STS research. Most of you will be familiar with Latour's insistence of talking about actants and giving up the distinction between human and non-human agency clearly has traces of cybernetic thinking. However, the normative public discourse on democracy, as well as democratic theory, has largely resisted this line of thought and held on to believe in anthropocentric, reason-based self-determination. With machine learning systems becoming widespread and more mainstream, the question is if this underlying cybernetic thinking that we see in so many corners of society, whether it might become so mainstream that also our thinking about democracy cannot longer resist it. I will now in the following give you a few indications that sort of seem to confirm this belief that cybernetic thinking might seep into our view, our perception of democracy. There are three areas I want to point out. First, I want to give you an example of how people today look at shortcomings of democracy that are in themselves rather old and traditional, but now might appear against the horizon of cybernetic thinking in a new light. The second area I want to look at is feedback loops as subject of democratic innovation. And third area concerns new types of vocabulary in the democratic discourse. So the area that a lot of democratic theory is working on and that also concerns is the subject of lots of what we call democratic experiments or areas of democratic innovation concern our understanding and our institutions of representation. Representation also in political theory has been problematized a lot because, as we know, there is a lot of fiction in the idea that all the people are represented by parliament that acts on behalf of the public will. I now use an example that I found recently through another talk on exactly this subject line. Someone pointed out a TED talk on the question of representation. So I will read a bit on from this TED talk to you to give you an idea of the flavor of cybernetic thinking in looking at problems or issues of democracy. So this TED talk from 2018 is by Cesar Hidalgo, and he starts out by saying that he is a little bit disappointed in democracy and wonders whether the other in the audience might also be disappointed. And then he carries on by saying, democracy has a basic vulnerability. And this consists in the idea of representation. In principle, democracy is the ability of people to exert power. But in practice, we have to delegate that power to a representative that can exert that power for us. That representative, says Cesar, is a bottleneck or a weak spot. And he carries on describing this a bit. Some people, he says, have been thinking about alternatives. And one of the ideas that is out there is the idea of direct democracy. This is the idea of bypassing politicians and having people vote directly on issues. But this idea, he says, is naive because there's too many things that we would need to choose. And then he lists the number of bills that the American Congress per year deals with and says people like us are unable to follow all these discussions and form their own opinion. So, as he says, there is a big cognitive bandwidth problem if we are going to try to think about direct democracy as a viable alternative. What if, he says, instead of trying to bypass politicians, we try to automate them? And the idea is combining direct democracy with software agents. Imagine for a second a world in which, instead of having a representative that represents you and millions of other people, you can have a representative that represents only you, with your nuanced political views, that weird combination of libertarian and liberal, and maybe a little bit conservative on some issues, and maybe very progressive on others. Politicians nowadays are packages, and they are full of compromises. But you might have someone that can represent only you, if you are willing to give up the idea that a representative is a human. If that representative is a software agent, and we could have a Senate that has as many senators as we have citizens. And what Caesar then does is go on to describe how each of us would first produce a big data set with all the information that is around about us, and then we would choose an algorithm to train that senator that is going to represent us, and he describes that there will be a market where we can choose the algorithm. We are not even forced to use one specific one. And then he ends by offering a last observation. One of the reasons why we use democracy so little may be because democracy has a very bad user interface. And if we improve the user interface of democracy, we might be able to use it more. So much for Cesar Hidalgo. You might say this is all nonsense. He represents typical American West Coast libertarian view on democracy. But if you look at, say, blockchain projects, for example, and study the young, enthusiastic men working on them and seriously believing that they can revolutionize democratic self-determination through the help of blockchain technology, you will find around the world very similar ways of looking at the problems of democracy. So one of the ideas is that technologies forms new horizons that allow us to look at age-old problems in new ways. Say there is an interaction between potential solution and their promises and the way we perceive our flawed world. Now, my second example that concerns practical examples of innovation in the area of democracy. And that example is liquid democracy. As you might know, it became famous in Germany around perhaps 2010 or a bit earlier with the Pirate Party, and many of you might think it also died with Pirate Party, but this is not quite true. There is a devoted community working on this system and still trying to implement it. And I think it's a good example for the combination of digital technologies and cybernetic thinking, which is driving experiments around democratic representation. The concept of liquid democracy describes a form of software-assisted decision-making which aims to combine elements of direct and representative democracy. Voters can either cast their vote directly, or they make use of proxy voting. In other words, delegating their vote to another person they find more competent than themselves. And of course, they can always withdraw their vote and use it again for themselves. The concept of liquid democracy is linked to liquid feedback, a so-called democracy software. The liquid aspect of liquid feedback promises real-time and potentially constantly changing representation of the voting community's present opinion. This way, it aims to create an accurate representation of the opinions without becoming distorted over time. So again, we see here certain solutions popping up against perceived problems of representative democracy, mainly that we vote only every 4 or 5 years, and in a way the representation isn't valid anymore and never really correct, because as Cesar Hidalgo said, each of our members of parliament is a package, but we might have different opinions on specific issues than that packaged representative. So the concept of democratic representation with liquid democracy switches from periodical feedback to a permanent feedback, not much different from the cybernetic idea of a machine. We have a permanent feedback cycle where we are always in charge and can decide who represents what opinion where. And liquid democracy also introduces this idea of having many rounds of voting. If we would refer to that in our election system, we would vote once, see the result, and then be allowed to vote again, because we can see that this might not be the outcome that we wanted. So this is a practical example. There are many others that tinker with representative democracy as we know it and try to introduce elements of direct democracy, thereby hoping to improve the entire system. So now I will briefly mention cybernetic vocabulary. I found just the other day a very nice article that tries to give an overview about the topic of democratic resilience. This is a topic that rises in democratic theory. There are many publications in this field, and I will now quote 2 things. First, how resilience, that's also a cybernetic term, as you might have guessed, how resilience is defined in engineering. Resilience in engineering is concerned with maintaining equilibrium of a system and relatedly the capacity to return to equilibrium should it get lost. And now we compare that to how resilience is defined in democratic thinking. A system's capacity to withstand a major shock, such as the onset of extreme polarization, and to continue to perform the basic functions of democratic governance: electoral accountability, representation, effective restraints on excessive or concentrated power, and collective decision-making. As you can see, from a perspective of resilience, democracy begins to shrink. It's like a machine that performs certain functions, and democratic resilience tries to protect these core functions or rebuild them should they get lost. What we don't see here is any, in this definition, is any reference to the substantial elements of democracy or to its normative component. All these things shrink and sort of disappear out of sight. The literature on democratic resilience treats democracy a bit machine-like, apparently without even being aware of it. So much to the question of vocabulary. What I haven't really talked about yet is the aspect of learning. I've shown in various areas that democracy seems to resemble machines, but now what is the issue of learning in this context? In a narrow sense, the machine that learns uses its output as input to adapt its behavior. Related to democracy, this might mean more systematic attention to the ways our democratic institutions respond to the feedback beyond the spectacle of elections and the theater of public debate. And it may raise the question if and how democratic institutions could improve their response to such feedback. In a wider sense, a democracy might become expected to learn as a matter of its legitimacy, meaning public expectations toward democracy might change and sort of shift more to how much is democracy able to change in the face of the problems with itself that it faces. For example, the government could welcome and support the various experiments at the democratic interface between the people and democratic institutions. In a more radical sense, this could imply a shift from democracy understood as a stable constitutional architecture of bodies, norms, rules, and processes towards a democracy that paradoxically resorts to more frequent, substantial change in order to maintain its stability. We could face a democratic crisis where our government begins to accept that democracy needs to change in order to survive. This could be a positive thing, but it could also be a negative thing. I'm not making a normative judgment. I'm just asking how could cybernetic thinking influence our understanding of democracy. To sum up, I used the imaginary of the state as a clock to make the point that many socio-technical changes seem to take place behind our back, meaning without us properly noticing them. A crucial question why it is so hard, if not impossible, to observe socio-technical change or transformations while they take place is that they imply changes of worldviews. It is a technology's quality of a medium that transforms our collective selves and our relationship to the world, as Gum puts it. Because technology is a medium, we are changing with the technology, and that makes it so hard to observe and describe and to sort of step back and reflect on technological change. The common gut reaction to new technologies as a threat that is particularly widespread in the German context, I think, often misses the point by simultaneously overestimating the short-term effects and being more or less blind to the long-term effects of new technologies. At the same time, it is a bit of a provocation to predict a new imaginary of democracy as a learning machine. Imaginaries evolve in the form of distributed unpredictable processes beyond the control of any individual actor. For this reason, it's much easier to study imaginaries ex post than anticipate them and study them ex ante. So the imaginary of democracy as a learning machine should be regarded as an exercise in sharpening our senses for the ways we will collectively make sense of AI and how this sense-making will in turn affect our understanding and practicing of democracy. Thank you very much.